Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Miss Matthews here with Dr. James Rogers, war historian, who's very kindly agreed to talk to us this afternoon about Nazi Germany and Hitler's rise to power. So, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's really exciting for all of us. So, would you mind telling us just a little bit about you and what you do and Untold History?
Oh yeah, sure. So like you said, I'm a war historian. I specialise in the First World War and the Second World War, but also the military technologies that arose out of that and some of the legacies of these conflicts as well. So I've just recently finished a book on the history of something which you might think doesn't have a really long history, but it's the history of drone warfare. And you can trace back this drone technology all the way back to 1916, 17, and the American reactions out of the First World War. And we'll talk a lot about the First World War today and some of the legacies from that and how it impacted Germany. But for the Americans, they had around 360,000 casualties, and they wanted to make sure that you'd never get involved in such an entrenched and bloody warfare again. And so they invested heavily in air power. Some of it was unmanned air power, some of it was remote controlled, and this is where you started to get drones that came out of the conflict as a means to try and really reduce the casualties in conflict.
Fantastic. That sounds really interesting. And you've got a book about it as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Drone warfare, concepts and controversies. And then a lot of what I do most recently is also broadcast on TV and podcasts. I currently present the Untold History series on Dan Snow's History Hit TV, and work a lot with the BBC. Did some stuff recently with BBC Horizon on BBC Two, and on the History Channel as well. We finished recording a series called Secret Skirmishes, which looked at the forgotten wars around the world from the Second World War through the Cold War.
Fantastic. I could absolutely question you all day about those things, but we're going to talk about Nazi Germany today.
Yes, today is Nazi Germany, yes.
So I've got a few questions that my students have submitted that they'd be really interested in asking. And I think we've got a few that kind of lend themselves to a chronological narrative, and then one that's kind of a bit more of an outlier. So maybe we could start with that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So it comes from a Year 12 student called Alex. She's doing her EPQ, her extended project on the effect of drug use on dictators. So she'd really like to know how Hitler engaged in drug use and what impact it had on him and his behaviour.
Wow, yeah. Well, first of all, that sounds like a fantastic topic to be focusing on, and one that's really now as well. When it comes down to an answer, I think the short answer is, well, yes, Hitler did take drugs, and yes, it did affect him quite massively. The longer answer is perhaps that he was as high as a kite for most of the war. There's a great new book by Norman Oller, where he argues that Hitler was blitzed on cocaine and opiates during the war, and it only got worse as the war went on. According to Oller and the papers of Hitler's personal physician, actually, Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's drug use went through 3 phases, and, well, put simply, it went through the roof. In the first phase, in the 1930s, Hitler was injected intravenously with a compound of vitamins, and this was in order to kind of boost up his immune system and just to make sure he was incredibly well. Remember, Hitler put a lot on physical fitness and, the prowess of the human body. But then as we started to move through, and as the war started from 1939, 1940, 1941, this is where his personal physician started to introduce opiates and also hormones as well. But here's where the opiates become really quite important, because Hitler's getting tired. The war is raging on. Germany is winning at this point, but it is tiring, and he needs to keep meeting his commitments every single day to meet with his generals. And one of the things that opiates allows is it stops fatigue, it reduces stress, and the tiredness that came with the war. Of course, the longer term negative effects of this were soon to be seen, because as we move through to the third and final phase of Hitler's drug use, well, we start to look from 1943 onwards. And this is a really important point, because from 1943, Germany starts to lose the war. And it's here that his opiate usage increases massively. It coincides with defeat in North Africa. You know, we're talking about El Alamein here, massive losses for the German forces and Rommel's troops. The fact that Rommel couldn't get the oil from Italy around Malta and into North Africa to supply his tanks and moves through is a major, major downfall for German forces. And it's these sort of decisions and these sort of really quite negative impacts of the war that take their toll on Hitler, and you start to see his drug use skyrocket. We might think that this is a trivial point. You know, what does it matter that Hitler took drugs? You know, it may say some things about him as a person, but we already know him as a pretty negative person. But I think that when you do look into this one narrow aspect of Hitler's life, it turns from just being a quirky fact of history into a really important point of understanding Hitler. Because remember, Hitler was seen as being publicly as a teetotaler. His body was a temple, like I said. He didn't drink. He was a vegetarian, and he explicitly in public associated the misuse of drugs with the Jewish people, and it was another reason that he argued why the Jewish race had to be removed from German society. In fact, anyone who misused substances, alcoholics or anyone who was seen as being on the edge of society and not conforming was removed, including the Romani peoples, for example. Now, there's a great irony to this, because Hitler was on drugs, and in fact, most of German society was on drugs at this point. Methamphetamines could be brought legally without prescription. They were a mood stimulant and a sleep suppressant, and they were used to wake the people of Germany up and to get even the laziest people working. They were even given to soldiers on the front line to make sure they didn't sleep, and they were jacked up and geared up to fight in battle. In fact, some historians say that it's one of the reasons why Hitler was able to move so quickly with Blitzkrieg in the early days of the war was because his soldiers didn't sleep. Now, there was one interesting aspect to the question that you asked that I'd just like to touch upon, and that's, how does this affect Hitler's leadership of Germany? Well, as the war dragged on and it became evident that the Nazis were even closer to defeat, Hitler's generals wondered why he remained just so optimistic and upbeat and certain that they would win the war. And many of his generals concluded that, well, Hitler must have a secret weapon that we don't know about, a war-winning weapon that can be deployed and turn the tide, and quite the serious, heavy tide that was coming in, that was seeing Germany defeated. Turns out, however, that he was just very, very high, and the decisions that he was making likely contributed to the poor decision-making, the misreading of facts, and the defeat of Nazi Germany.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. Really, I didn't know a lot of that, so it's really interesting for me to hear as well.
Yeah, no worries.
Fantastic. Should we move on then to the more broader kind of questions of how Hitler rose to power?
Yeah, sure. I'll try my best.
Super. So we have a couple of questions that sort of link together nicely. The first of which is basically, how did a democratic government actually allow for a totalitarian dictatorship to take hold in the first place? Because the Weimar Constitution was designed to be one of the most democratic in the world at its time. And so of all places, it seems among the most unlikely for a dictatorship to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose just drilling down into that question a little bit, the question is, how did someone like Hitler, hell-bent on imposing a totalitarian regime, rise to power in a wholly democratic country?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, of course, that question remains really quite ever-present today as well. And I think whenever we're learning about this history is so important, because it allows us to understand the world we live in and make appropriate analogies from the past and apply them to learn lessons about the present and the future. So I suppose as we discuss this one, maybe see if we can draw some analogies to the present day as well. I'm sure you do this in your class as well, some of which are quite disturbingly obvious.
Yes.
Yeah, but in the German case, we have to go back to 1918. Now, as I said, I'm a war historian, so I'm slightly biased here in the fact that I believe war shapes societies quite dramatically. as well. In fact, I think that the societies we live in and the people we become is actually based upon war. We just need to look at our basic family trees to see how our personal lives and personal relationships have been shaped by war. And this is what happens in Germany from 1918 onwards. War shapes this society. With the Germans' defeat to the Allies in 1918 and the signing of the armistice and the collapse of the imperial government, there is unrest. There are protests, and strikes spread rapidly across Germany, bringing the country to a virtual economic and social standstill. And there were fears from the politicians of this period that this unrest was being stoked by communist factions, something that was a fear around the Western world at this time.
Mm-hmm. Because of
And
course
as
you have in the 1917, sorry, you have the February and October revolutions in Russia, which is only next door but Poland to Germany, so not far at all. And it's Rosa Luxemburg, isn't it, that leads the Spartacist uprising with the KPD in Germany.
So this is it. These fears aren't unfounded,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in fact, they're probably quite serious at this point. But communism remains, I mean, it remains through the 20th century as something which is a rallying point for Western democracies to mobilize their peoples and get them on side. You just need to look at the Cold War and McCarthyism and the Red Scare and all of these things. But back at this point, it is equally as potent. And like you say, after 1917, perhaps not, if not more so. And so what they aim to do is they aim to suppress this communist uprising by the major parties in Germany joining together and to establish this kind of parliamentary democracy, which they named the Weimar Republic, a democratic parliamentary democracy. Now, this is important because the new Weimar Republic had the responsibility imposed upon them by the victors of World War I of having to implement the peace agreement which they signed, and none of which was particularly popular with a disgruntled German public. And this included Germany giving up vast swathes of its empire, around 10% of its empire, and demolishing its vast army as well. And think of the unemployment that leaves after this period. But one large sticking point was that Germany, a defeated nation whose people were reeling in hardship, had to pay reparations to the Allied victors. And this took even more money out of the German economy and left the country in, well, an impoverished, and I would say, a humiliating situation. And it's here that you start to get the veterans from the Great War and German nationalists who rise up in protest against the politicians who they believe were stabbing them in the back once again. Remember, the politicians had stabbed them in the back once before, or so the veterans thought, when they ended the war, a war which had not seen the German military defeated, at least not entirely, but had seen the political will of the politicians to give that fight defeated. And so the politicians bring an end to this war. So, I mean, it's at this point here that we start to see how the tide of public opinion is turning against this fledgling Weimar Republic and this democratic, this parliamentary democracy. And these views rise in popularity, and they become an obsession of Adolf Hitler himself, a younger Adolf Hitler at this point, who is a veteran of the First World War. And Hitler, of course, from very, very early on, this isn't a later point, it's from at least 1919 onwards, Hitler is also blaming the Jewish people in Germany for this problem. And this was not a marginal view in a country where anti-Semitism was rife. And so Hitler starts to see how he can build upon this growing resentment, this fear, this anger, this scapegoating of the Jewish people. Not facts, remember these aren't facts. And he gains popularity. And it's at this point he also joins up with a small party, Nationalist Socialist Party, later the Nazi Party, and he draws larger and larger crowds until he rose to power. Hitler was actually sent by the German military to go and spy on the people meeting for National Socialism, but he gets enthralled by the idea, and its leader says, well, why don't you join up? And so he does. And I suppose from this point on, with this powerful rhetoric, and Hitler is, as we know, a powerful speaker, his popularity increases and he rises up the ranks to power.
He officially takes over in 1921 as the leader of the National Socialist Party, I think, from the predecessor.
Which is pretty quick, right?
Very quick, from 2 years being a nobody sent by the army to spy from a corner to being the front runner of the party. Incredibly quick.
This is a charismatic man with disturbing ideas on a mission to power.
But ones that resonate with the nationalists of Germany, particularly in Bavaria.
Yeah, and more broadly as well, as we see as the 1930s drag on.
Fantastic. So what happens next then? So he's in charge of the party, but this is at this moment a very small party, yes?
Yes, absolutely. So, well, I can go into a little bit more detail in how Hitler rose to power, if that would be useful.
Fantastic. Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. So, as we know, he joins the National Socialists, and I suppose it's at this point we can really delve in a little bit deeper and see what happens next, because he was gaining more and more popularity for his extreme views. In fact, some historians would say that it went to his head to a point where he tries to kind of overthrow power and take power for himself. So he tries to overthrow government, and this ends him in jail, charged with treason, actually, which is probably an appropriate charge if you try and overthrow the powers that be. And this throws him into prison for 12 months, I think, until he's released. And it's interesting because Hitler develops his ideas, as we know, while he's in prison, and we know about kind of the writing of things like Mein Kampf and his manifesto, and these important points of Hitler's life and the thinking time he gets. And this, as fate would have it, coincides with 1929, as he comes out of prison, and the point at which the Great Depression hits the world. Now, these are dark times for the world, and especially Germany. American banks, which had been loaning money to Germany, recall all of their loans. And so Germany falls deeper and deeper into economic recession, and the people of the country suffer further and further. Remember, they hadn't been rich beforehand. They were paying reparations. They were damaged from a long, protracted war of attrition.
And then suffering from hyperinflation in 1923 as well. People carting literal wheelbarrows full of money around, which couldn't buy bread, and changed value hour after hour. Must have been absolutely insane.
Exactly. And that's a really important point, because we need to understand that social context in which Hitler is able to rise to power and provide people with an alternative to the hardship that they are facing. So Germany's crippled, it's suffering. And it's here that Hitler's rhetoric of blame and in fact, this is often overlooked, but importantly, his ambition to rebuild Germany, not to be as good as its former imperial greatness, but to surpass Germany's great empire. You know, he always thought that Germany didn't go far enough to create an empire. And so this was about moving Germany on in greatness, in its histories. Its greatest times were still to come. And this was a popular message. It had traction, and it saw him rising up the polls. He went from around 3%, 2.7, I think it was, of a stake in the Democratic parliamentary vote, up to 18%. Quite quickly. I think 17.6%, not quite 18%. And that was in just 2 years. I don't know many political parties that have been able to rise so quickly in the rankings.
So as far as the Nazis are concerned then, although the uprising, the Munich Putsch, was initially a failure, because Hitler runs away, he looks like a coward. The trial gives him a platform not only to spread the message, but then his subsequent time in prison allows him to organize his thoughts and realize, okay, Mussolini managed to take Italy by force. I can't do that here. I need a different way. And so he's able to kind of organize and plan and look at the loopholes that exist within the system.
Yeah, and he's built a dedicated radical base around him, a radical base that he later purges himself, remember, so as not to have any sort of anyone challenging him for power. but these are so useful to him at this time, and they're causing unrest themselves in the streets, unrest that he plays upon, and says that, you know, this is either the Jews or it's a communist uprising as well. And it's based upon this rhetoric, this anti-Jewish rhetoric, this anti-communist rhetoric, this anti-establishment hate, that he again rises up further and further. And again, Hitler, buoyed by this popularity, runs for president. Now he loses, and it goes to the decorated war hero General von Hindenburg. But Hitler won almost 40% of the vote. I think it was 38% of the vote in that contest. And so Hindenburg gets convinced to appoint Hitler as chancellor. They believe that they can ride on Hitler's popularity as a means to kind bring in the political reform that they want to bring in. Little do they know that Hitler himself is a mover, a shaker, a hustler who is hell-bent on power himself. And also, the Chancellor is a largely administrative role at this time, but Hitler manages to, again, tweak the rules slightly so that he's able to take more and more power in this role as Chancellor. At the same time, Hitler's dedicated die-hard base is forming into violent paramilitary groups that suppress opposition, and they play again on this idea that there is a major threat from communism and a communist uprising, and that Hitler is the only person in Germany that can restore law and order and can defeat this communist threat.
So it's very convenient for Hitler then, a month after he becomes Chancellor, that the Reichstag fire, supposedly committed by a young communist, takes place, which then gives fuel to his arguments that there is a very real threat.
Convenient, to say the least. So yes, a young communist worker sets fire to the government Reichstag building, the Reichstag fire, a famous focal point in this history, and Hitler uses this to convince the government to give him emergency powers. Now, these emergency powers allow him to rapidly, and I mean rapidly, bypass Parliament, to, you know, invoke laws by decree, and within 1 month there has been a ban on the freedom of the press. Freedom of the press in a democracy is abolished within 1 month. Other political parties are disbanded. Democracy has gone, and anti-Jewish laws are passed. In 1934, President Hindenburg dies, another convenient thing for Hitler here, and no election was to be held. Democracy had disappeared, and a totalitarian, authoritarian rule had come over Germany. Hitler was now in charge, and he was powerful, and powerful people began to back him. Businesses, politicians began to back Hitler, convinced in their own mind, and probably justifying it to themselves, that the more extreme side to Hitler was just for show. And it's here, of course, that, well, the rest really is history. But it's an important history that reminds us of how democracies can be manipulated, how they can be subverted by an angry population and a charismatic leader who is willing to play on fear and poverty and hardship and bigotry in order to rise to power.
Themes that you could probably draw all the way through the 20th and into the 21st century there.
I'll allow you to do that in the classroom.
Yeah. So I need to say thank you to Matilda for that question.
Great question.
It's followed on quite nicely by the most popular question I had, which came from, amongst others, Orla, Alice, and also Chanel, who basically wanted to know, well, why are people voting for him then? What's his appeal or why do people allow him to continue in 1933 once they must surely realise that this wasn't what the government was intended for? So how do they reconcile with that in their minds?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? And I think it draws back to a lot of the points that we've already touched upon. Germany is an impoverished country to a point where, like you say, there's been hyperinflation. We have a point of where Germany is in some cases is starving. It's running low on supplies. People don't have jobs. People are desperate. And it's at this point you get someone who is not a part of the establishment, someone who at least says they're not part of the establishment. I mean, you look at Hitler's history. He says that, you know, he lived on the streets. You know, he was someone who'd been let down by the system. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Hitler was middle class, if not slightly higher up than middle class, someone who had made good by playing on this down-hard and man of the people rhetoric. But it's a rhetoric that worked really well. He's someone that people could identify with, someone who would drag Germany up by the bootstraps and restore them to that former greatness that I spoke about before. He also provided these convenient scapegoats. So to be able to place all of this on the Jewish peoples, something that is completely erroneous, you know, this is a point where Hitler, from very early on, is saying that Germany lost the First World War because of the Jews. The Jews after the war have made lots of money off war profiteering, again, not true, but something that Hitler convinces people is true. And if he comes to power, he can get rid of the Jews from German society. I mean, Hitler, all the way through the war, is blaming the Jewish peoples for any defeat that they have. You know, it's the Jewish peoples who are controlling Churchill, who are controlling Stalin, who are making him make the mistakes. Going back to the previous point, you know, he's incredibly high on drugs as well at this point. And so he becomes fanatically obsessed. And it's these justifications that he gives to the German people to allow them to vote him into power, to give him a chance to restore them to greatness. I think the economic fact of it, people's lives, the fact that you can give them a purpose, you can put them back into industry, you can talk about restoring the German military. That is a great affront to the German people. And we can go back to the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that such strict measures had been imposed on the German people, and how, you know, Hitler played on this to be able to say, well, actually, this is too harsh, and we need to be able to, well, fight back against this and rise up as a proud nation, a nation which had ruled large swathes of the world. So it's populism. It's Hitler's, he got the perfect recipe for that social economic period in time that meant that the people would support him. And so for me, it's that. And one thing I tell my students when I'm lecturing at university is never to underestimate the power of a charismatic leader as well, because someone who can draw people together like that is actually quite hard to find. And when they're put in positions of power and they use that power to subvert a political narrative and a population, well then some quite catastrophic things can happen.
Well, the Jews, of course, make quite a good scapegoat for Hitler because they have an unfortunate history of persecution throughout Europe, also in Britain and England back in the medieval period. So they have, there's a foundation there for that. And it's also very convenient that they make up less than 1% of the German population at the time. And so they're not big enough peoples to actually have a strong movement against the Nazi party, but they're able to be extrapolated into a much bigger demon because of the past and foundational premise for using them as scapegoats.
Exactly, and there are visible peoples who own local businesses and who people resent, especially those in Germany who, you know, have no money and have no business, and they become even more visible when Hitler passes his laws to make them so. So you have to identify as being Jewish in public as well. So yeah, not a stupid man, a man who knew what he was doing and how to drum up popular support.
Absolutely, and I suppose he would play as well on this idea of not wanting to go back to hyperinflation. So if he can provide jobs and if he can provide work and bread and living space, then he's going to be able to prevent the country from reversing back to the state that they were in 1923.
Exactly, and if you look at some of Hitler's speeches, he, you know, describes himself as being part of the farmers, part of the workers, part of the people. And if you can keep bread in their bellies and give them a purpose, then they're going to support you all the way to the top.
Only reinforced by Goebbels and his wonderful but hideous propaganda machine.
Absolutely, and that's a different story for a different day. But yes,
Absolutely.
the team he builds are effective.
Very much so. Fantastic. I think that's covered the question amazingly. Thank you so much for answering those. Is there anything that you'd like to kind of finish off with what's your Twitter or Instagram handle? Because I'm sure that many of my students would be really interested in pursuing what you do.
Yeah, sure.
After this
Well,
ends.
the Instagram handle is at Untold History TV, and the Twitter handle is at Dr. James Rogers. And your students are more than welcome to drop me an email, which you have my email address, and we'll answer some questions on Instagram as well, hopefully.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much for your time today. It's really appreciated. And thank you on behalf of my students as well. I know that they'll enjoy watching this too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.